What's behind the biggest Africa summit on Russian soil since the fall of the Soviet Union? Vladimir Putin welcoming more than 40 leaders to the Black Sea resort of Sochi, hot on the heels of that deal he brokered Tuesday with Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds. Another diplomatic coup that's sure to be picked up by his guests who see U.S. foreign presence on the retreat, and a U.K. in the throes of Brexit. They also get the value of hedging their bets when it comes to strategic partnerships with the likes of China and France. But those leaders also know that when it comes to Africa, Moscow's economic might lags. Beyond traditional staples such as arms sales and intelligence, what can Russia bring? And what does it want? We'll ask our panel and ask why Russia has taken a sudden interest in the likes of the Central African Republic and Congo, resource-rich countries with weak states. Could we see a return to the Cold War days when the Soviets held sway everywhere stretching from Angola to Algeria? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Russia's role in Africa. And with us is Anastasia Chapotchinka, lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Also with us, he is the publisher of Afrique magazine, the monthly Ziad Liman. We're joined as well by Andrea Ngombe, associate researcher at the IPSE think tank.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show. And he was not a journalist when they built the Berlin Wall, but George Cazalis...
No, I wasn't. You're right. When they took it down.
George Cazalis, who teaches, former colleague who teaches at the École Supérieure de Journalisme. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. All 54 nations on the continent represented, more than 3,000 delegates talking about, well, everything from... helicopter purchases, to nuclear technology, to mineral extraction, and yes, arms sales. Alan Gainsford has more.
He's on a charm offensive. The Russian president is looking for new allies and trading partners. At the Russia-Africa summit he's hosting in Sochi, Vladimir Putin set out his plans to boost trade with the continent.
We have very good potential for development. We have much to discuss. All this allows us to count on a further increase in trade. I believe that it is within our power to at least double the volume of trade in the next 4 to 5 years.
Russia plans to build its export market, from wheat and fertilizers to energy and weapons, which it already sells to around 30 African countries. It's especially interested in Africa's oil reserves and in mining. Russian companies have made a breakthrough in the diamond sector. But Russia has a long road ahead. Its exports to the continent were estimated at 20 billion euros in 2018, while China exported more than 200 billion euros. Russia also trails behind the EU, India, the US, and Gulf states, in what's been dubbed the third scramble for Africa, as world powers vie for influence in the continent. Now, Putin is looking to regain some of the leverage lost following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a project that's welcomed by guest of honor Abdel Fattah el-Sisi.
We consider Russia a reliable partner of the African continent. We really hope Russia will work in Africa in all spheres and sectors, including financing infrastructure facilities, the energy sphere, and road construction.
For African states, the more foreign powers competing to invest in their economies, the better. But critics say that Russia has little concern for human rights or transparency as it seeks to expand its footprint.
Andrea Ngombe, is there a third scramble for Africa, as we heard in that report?
Not really, because the African continent has many partners and they can now talk for themselves. But we need to have a strategy. We need to have people, inspiring leaders like the one in Ethiopia or elsewhere, because it's not just the Russian coming, it's also the African searching for a new partner around the world.
Yeah, we had Vladimir Putin congratulating Abiy Ahmed over winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
Everybody is congratulating the guys now.
Right, Ethiopia's leader. What do you make of this summit? What's it all about?
I think mostly it's about for Russia to gain new influences in Africa and also to say that they are back. Russia is back, and they can go beyond the sanction from the Western country, and they need to show power, show muscles, and also it's a matter of access to what we call warm sea for Russia, like in Mediterranean Sea and the Guinea Gulf. So it's more about.
All right, Ziad Liman, I'm going to ask you if Russia's back, but let's look at a map to do so. We recall the end of the Cold War. Moscow closes a slew of embassies on the continent, and now there's a definite push of late. There's projects, security cooperation, and it goes, as you can see on this map, well beyond former Soviet-aligned countries. Your thoughts when you look at that map?
I think it's like a kind of reset, because it's pretty hard to compare what's going on now and what happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago. I mean, the Cold War context was East versus West. Every position was important. There was real war fought on the ground. If you think, for example, at the Angolan War, there were Russian forces, Cuban forces involved against a regime which was supported by South Africa, and the Americans were playing. I mean, this is a different story, a different world, and you're not playing it again. But ties have been made. If you look, for example, at marriages or students, tens of thousands of students went to Lumumba University, to
in Moscow.
Yes, and they speak Russian, or they used to speak Russian. They were married to Russian wives, and they went to Africa. And you had this thing going that stopped at the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it stopped also because suddenly Russia didn't have anything to bring anymore, because the deal was security and East-West war. Now, what Africa needs, what? Investment, capital, ideas, technology, intelligence, and security. So that's the chapter where you can find a new Russia-Africa deal today, is security, diplomacy, strategic thinking. Because for the rest, it's short on terms, because basically Russia needs raw materials, but Africa needs investment. Russia needs export markets for some of its products, including arms, but Africa needs export market too. Africa needs to balance, as you said, its strategic interest between China, Europe, America, but the level of Russian trade is too small to balance that yet. But if you can say, I'm friendly with Putin, who is a very popular figure in Africa, don't know why, maybe you could explain us why Putin is such a popular figure in Africa, because he resists to the West, he resists to America, he's a strong guy. I mean, all that stuff works, but still it's $17 billion or $20 billion exchange. So it's too short to make a real difference with China, with
We saw
Europe.
in that report him going all in alongside Egypt's president, the pair of them back the nationalist leader, General Haftar in Libya.
Yeah.
Is this about economics at all, or is it just about politics?
No, always in those stories, it's about economics. I mean, Libya is an oil state, basically, so it's not.
So is Russia.
Well, but if you have more oil, it's always better. And if you control more oil resources, it's always better. And if you have a friend in Tripoli, it's always better.
Do you agree with that, Anastasia?
It's about resources. It's also about geopolitical influence. As our first guest mentioned, of course, for Africa, it's a win-win situation for Africa and Russia. For African leaders, it's a way to diversify from what is perceived as monopolization, privatization of Africa by China, as overwhelming, post-colonial influence by the European countries, or overwhelming influence by the U.S., including through U.S. aid. And that is also not popular. Compared to the US, compared to the Chinese or the Europeans, Russians are perceived positively, and that's a historical perception. One of the reasons why is because Russian influence, and historically so as well, and today continues, in addition to, of course, the main interest for the state as weapons trade, and then around the resources in exchange for resources and economic exchanges, also has included always cultural ties through education, as our guest has mentioned, but also through, for example, some humanitarian missions or medical assistance. There are a lot of, there's a very famous even judicial case of Russian nurses and also Eastern European nurses being condemned in Libya, etc. But this means that there was this presence, and hence the marriages not only of Africans who went to Russia, but of Russians who went to Africa. Also a lot of technical personality.
But hang on, Anastasia. The whole idea of this summit was hatched right on the heels of Putin meeting with Sisi or meeting with Haftar to discuss the situation in Libya. It's all about politics,
this
right?
This was just to address the point of why the Russians are more popular than other people in Africa. However, of course, for Russia, Africa is extraordinarily important, especially today, and it's not overly new. If we look back to 10 years back, Russia was portraying BRICS, was posing in front of BRICS as an alternative to Western institutions, South Africa being the S, right? And then Brazil and then India, the other two letters. And so it's not extraordinarily new. The nuclear negotiations and about possibility of nuclear power plants were conducted in South Africa for many years until South Africa stopped the negotiations, and in Nigeria before they were stopped. And now they continue and Russia is posing in countries such as Kenya, Sudan, and Uganda. But and this may be a lot of posing as well, but a lot of it, of course, is geopolitics. Then Libya, traditional country of influence, Angola, right-hand man of Putin, Igor Sechin, one of the most influential people in Russia. He made his career in Angola, supposedly as an interpreter. His career is in KGB. So obviously, given the events in Angola during the Soviet times, we understand what he was doing there. Algeria, extraordinary influence, ideological, financial, and it's after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from there that Algeria started having extreme Muslim extremist issues, and which are overlapping today. Libya is exercising the same type of diplomatic influence that Russia is interested in, and Russia's been using Libya, and Libya has been using Russia throughout the years. Over the search for credit and money, Russia is a perfect source of that. Not only, like with Egypt, by proposing government-backed, therefore unlimited credit, for example, for construction of nuclear power plant. Egypt just signed a deal, $25 billion Russian guaranteed credit for construction of a nuclear power plant in Egypt, but also through forgiving debts under the UN label of the least developed countries.
And without all those pesky questions about human rights. George Kazolius, win-win for the African leaders and Putin. Is it win-win for the African citizens, ordinary citizens?
Well, I think that African citizens are very intelligent. You can see that when they're being ripped off by other powers. I mean, it's absolutely clear with China. We've had anti-Chinese riots all over Africa. Zuma, the former president of South Africa, said 10 years ago, he warned Africans, do not replace one imperialist colonizer with another, warning them against China. I think Africans have everything to win by working with Russia, who is a dependable partner. You know, if you sign up with Russia, he's not going to run away, turn his back, pull out his troops, take his money. He's going to stick with you to the end. And he showed that. And he's amazing in diplomacy. He was with Erdogan yesterday. He's with Sisi today. Those two are enemies. Those two are threatening each other with war.
Right. On this, I want to bring in William Gumede from Johannesburg, Executive Chair of the Democracy Works Foundation. William, you were, as a teenager, an anti-apartheid activist at the time. The Soviet Union was a big backer of the ANC. What's the perception where you are of this summit today?
Yeah, so I mean, I must tell you, just first a little bit of background is that, the ANC and Russia, I mean, before the Soviet Union, have very, very close links, most probably the most closest links of any African countries. I mean, the first alliance struck with the ANC was in the 1920s already, and it was through the South African Communist Party, Africa's oldest communist party. It was struck in the early 1920s, and just after the Second World War, the old Soviet Union actually set up an elite program for the ANC from the late 1950s, 1958 to 1959, and it ended at the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, where every year the top elites of the ANC in exile went for training. So every year they would take, between 25 and 50 of the top leadership of young leaders of the ANC has gone through their training. And then, I mean,
so what, is this the return of an old friend?
Yeah, it's been a very, very long. you have to imagine that now over 4 generations of the ANC's top elite leaders were trained in Russia from the 1950s, and that the ANC had a formal relationship since the 1920s. So it's a really, really deep. And I mean, during the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, almost every black medical doctor, because, it was very difficult to study medicine if you're black or any technical subjects, or engineering and so on. So almost everyone, or the majority, studied in Russia, and of course, in Eastern Europe, but in the bulk of them in Russia. So that really is, so it's a quite significant partnership and relationship with the ANC.
It's a deep history. We're going to have to take a quick break because, but when we come back, I'll be asking you about the present and today, how people view this summit in Sochi. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're reacting to the biggest African summit on Russian soil since the end of the Cold War. We're talking about it with Anastasia Shapochkina, who's a lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. We're also in the company of Ziad Liman, editor-in-chief of, publisher and editor-in-chief of Afrique Magazine. Everything.
All the jobs.
Andrea Ngombe, associate researcher at the IPSE think tank, who hails from Congo.
Yeah, I'm from Congo Brazzaville, and I have a quick comment.
Just let me say hello to everybody else, and then we'll get back to it in a minute. George Kazolius, who teaches at the École Supérieure du Journalisme, the journalism school, and from Johannesburg, William Gumedi, executive chair of the Democracy Works Foundation. Andrea, let's look once more at Russia's role in the continent, on par in terms of trade, right, with Turkey and Brazil, and less than half of that of France. France is around 51 billion euros. I guess you got to do the math to say what that is in dollars. But again, it gets back to that question: is this about economics, this summit, or is it just about politics? Really,
I really think it's not about economy, because when you see the long term and the deep of the foreign policy of Russia. Russia is a landlocked empire, and all the politics of Russia was to go deeper in the south or in the east. So going to Africa is a way for Russia to have a new access to a warm sea like the Mediterranean Sea and all the South Atlantic Sea. They need to be more in the sea to control the access and the resource, and to not be dependent just from Europe or even China. So they really need Africa to have this kind of long view and expansion for their army, their interest. And also, we must not forget that Russia is a permanent Security Council member, and they trade their veto to every power they can. And it's more about that and not just for economy.
One big announcement, George Kazolius, that's come out so far is the sale of 12 fighter helicopters by Russia to Niger. Niger, a former French colony.
That's very interesting, because Niger would like to break the monopoly that the French and Areva have on the uranium in that country. They don't think they're getting a fair deal. And if they could get some other partners in there to exploit uranium, create a little bit of competition, they might get a fair deal out of that. But there's more than that. I mean, look at Ivory Coast is thinking of doing military cooperation with Russia. That really indicates that something's changed in the relationship with France in Africa.
And we saw the leader of the Central African Republic at the summit ask Russia to try to help lift the arms embargo that's been in force there.
No, but I mean, the fact that Russia sells arms is not new. It's something they know how to do. They have good stuff. Usually it's not overpriced. And it allows the African state or any other state to have some leverage. I mean, you buy 4 helicopters from Russia, and then you go back to France or you go back to America and say, see, I bought those helicopters, but now I want this stuff that you don't want to sell me. So it's just fair game. The discussion is, if you want to have a global reach, if you want to have global impact, if you want to be a partner, you need soft power. it's not only about arms, it's not only about your strategic depth, it's how you can convert African elites, students.
So we've seen that
businessmen.
with a push by Russian media in Africa.
Yeah,
Places like
okay.
Madagascar, they've bought the
Yes, RT, like France, but I don't think it's soft power. I mean, for example, the soft power asset for Russia is to position itself as the guy in the game who resists to America. That's soft power, and that's why a lot of
Resist to France.
well, France is not that.
Mayotte,
No,
Mayotte,
I mean, France is
Central
not
African
that
Republic.
big. You know, it's not that big country. It's not that. I mean, for those guys who think Putin is a tough guy, it's because he's a tough guy against the Americans, against colonialism and against imperialism and against all those ideas. And no, I'm not saying it's the truth. I'm saying that's the way he's perceived.
And this is the official discourse of Moscow as
And
well.
it's also the way the Russians sell themselves. But then again, your trade is about the same as Turkey.
Except we've seen in the past 2 years some surprising developments, most notably in the Central African
Yes.
Republic, where
Think
the French
about-
troops pull out, and suddenly, overnight, boom, you've got a Russian presence.
First of all, the French
didn't
troop,
pull out.
First of all, the
didn't
French
pull
troop
out.
didn't pull out totally. They reduced their level of involvement. And secondly, again, Central African Republic is a failed state with a lot of wealth underneath. And again, we need, I mean, most of these players, Russian, Chinese, European, French, whatever, Brazilians, Turkish, etc., they want to access to this wealth. And Africa is a wealth provider, and it's untapped, so you can go and try. And if you can deal with a failed state, it's even easier. And then when you get into the gray area, and then when you get into how soft power can bring or not support your strategy, when you bring mercenaries or when you bring shadowy kind of organization that supplies security, I mean, Africans are not totally blind. I mean, they can see what's going on, and they can see the influence these guys may have on a state operation.
Let's talk about it, because there's one man who's on everybody's lips as this summit gets underway. He's been called Putin's chef. He's 58 years old. His name is Evgeny Prigozhin. And after doing hard time in the 1980s for banditry, he started as a hot dog salesman, became a caterer for the Kremlin, now seems to be playing middleman on the continent. It's the same Prigozhin, by the way, who's been named in the Mueller report in the United States for allegedly running troll farms to influence the 2016 U.S. election. He heads a mercenary security outfit called Wagner, which is present in Ukraine, but also, most notably, in the DR Congo and the Central African Republic, the CAR, where they started ensuring the president's security detail when the French pulled back, if you will. In July of last year, 3 Russian journalists were killed in the CAR. They were investigating Prigozhin and Wagner, documents linked by the Dossier Center. That's a research group associated with exiled Russian dissident Mikhail Khodorkovsky, claimed that Russia is targeting 13 African nations in total, with everything from arms sales to support for pro-Kremlin media outfits in places like Madagascar, where they now have the biggest circulation daily newspaper. But to get back to the CAR, what is that Russian involvement in CAR all about for you?
I met President Touadéra in TICAD 7 in Yokohama, and we must separate two things. Mr. Touadéra was right to call for the Russian for arms and to try to ease the conflict in the country. But the guys you just presented is involving in what we can call in information warfare. So he's doing what we can call now Pravda 2.0. So it's all techniques with new technology.
Putin comes with Prigozhin if you're in CAR.
It's just all technique with new technology. And they are on their own agenda, on nationalism agenda, exciting extremism all over the world, exciting people like Camille Seba, which is one of the most famous activists on anti-French agenda. And also on the other end, you have what they call the Western media and news like France 24, who from their perspective are also trying to evangelize Africa on kind of Western values. So,
All right, so Anastasia Shapochkinka.
It's a war going on.
As Shapochkinka, there's an old adage, right? It's creating mischief when it comes to propaganda and the information war, if you will, between East and West in the days of the Soviet Union. Is that what Russia's ultimate aim is in a place like CAR?
I would say that I would definitely agree with our guest that Russia, same as in Europe, Russia is leveraging on anti-Americanism in very powerful European nations like in France, in the anti-American sentiment and the desire of the French leaders to position themselves counterbalancing America. Same thing Russia is leveraging on the anti-colonialist sentiment and tapping into the anti-colonialist sentiment in Africa. Same thing. And this weak trade position, I'm wondering if it is not serving Russia well, actually positioning itself as an underdog, as somebody, well, of course, I am uncomparable to China. Look at my numbers. I'm not there to rob you of your wealth. While, of course, the agenda behind is exactly the same as everyone else, is to tap into the rich resources. However, what I want to add on the propaganda point is that media is not the only rabbit in the hat of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Yevgeny Prigozhin owns, as you mentioned, a large private army, and thanks to this army in Africa today, he is trying to reach the same deals as they reached in Syria by providing military aid and securing areas, geographic areas with oil resources and refineries, then in exchange for share in the refineries and in the oil fields. Same deals are proposed to African leaders. So on the other hand, Russia is tapping in the needs of the African leaders, not just to close the eyes on the human rights or whatever. To tell you the truth, American companies, oil companies present in Africa, they are not really caring about human rights either, or French companies for that matter. It's just they're also tapping into the need of those leaders to help them rig elections, and Russia masters that issue. And they are providing through Prigozhin also advisors, not only national security advisors and bodyguards, but advisors on elections in countries like DRC, Madagascar, or others.
William Gumede, you agree? William Gumede, you agree that well, if you have Vladimir Putin, he comes with a Yevgeny Prigozhin, somebody who does, the dirty work that helps strongmen get their way, and in exchange for money and raw materials.
Russia, has, there's a couple of interests in Africa, of course. The first is a political interest. Putin sees himself as a global player, competing with Trump and the Chinese leader and so on. So that's the very first thing, is influence, political influence. So, so a couple of years ago, just under a decade ago, Putin returned, in the footsteps of the old Soviet Union. But what has happened in the last couple of years is expansion beyond the old former African liberation movements that partnered with the Soviet Union to beyond that now. Now, the second thing is not just a political, but it's also the economic of bringing the Russians are being, there's a war being built around Russia by the West, sanctions and so on. So the Russians need, they need markets and they need resources because they can't get it out of the West. They can't sell their things. So Africa is a place where they can do that. And from Putin's point of view, chaos in Africa is really good. Strongman in Africa is very good. If you have a typical African country with a strongman and so on, they just strike deals on behalf, which is in their own self-interest. They don't really care about their people. Now, that really works perfectly for a person of Putin. And then the second part of it, when they come to think chaos, failed states like a Central African Republic or Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a failed state totally, no government, a real effective government. It works very much if you, a Putin type of person, because what you then do is, you align yourself with, the nominal leader and then with some of the key rebels or forces, militia, and so on, and you get your resources out. And also in return, you can train, the nominal national government army, the police forces, and so on. You get something in return. You can pay off your national leader, pay off the warlords, and you become a market for products or commodities, mostly that would not have been able to be taken out of their country.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this, Andre Ngombe. What do ordinary citizens think when they hear about people like Yevgeny Prigozhin and suspicions around the murder of those 3 journalists who were investigating him?
There's two sides of the sentiment of public opinion in Africa. There's one side who really doesn't like Western people. They don't want to get rid of what they call colonialism and imperialism. And they are really kind to be in the Russian flow. And you have also the other flow who just want to make a living, and they don't want to be killed by anyone from Wagner company or any else company. And they're trying to survive in this kind of, as I mentioned, this information war going on. And to be fair, the guys are from Wagner and the Russians are just filling the void left by PR company from Western country who can't operate anymore in Africa, like the Bell Potential company collapsed for the Gupta leaks in South Africa, and many more companies from Western countries, they can't operate in Africa freely because of the new regulation. So the Western PR strategy is filling the void the African autocrat needs. So it's a kind of for strong people against.
But is it a long-term plan, George Kazolis?
I don't understand that. You make it sound like the Russians are doing something nobody else is doing.
No, I don't say that.
Everywhere I've gone, there have been so-called private contractors operating, protecting oil wells, protecting. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Embassy in Bangui, when I was there last in December 17, was run by private contractors. There wasn't an ambassador there. They were giving the orders to the diplomats what they could do and could not do. You make it sound like the Russians are doing something nobody else is doing.
I think Russia has changed, and Africa has changed. I mean, you're not talking about the same level of. Africa has went way up on the learning curve in terms of diplomatic negotiation strategy, etc. And they can they can leverage their asset. They can play between China, Europe, Russia now, and everything. And those guys are not naive. And when we talk about this kind of shadowy approach, you are always on some sort of failed state situation. If you go in a more organized situation, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, let's talk about that a second.
Go ahead. Second thing, go ahead, because you made.
No, I was going to say the Russia's. It's not been that great a year. When you look at, for instance, they were close to. They had close ties with Algiers. Their leader's gone. Yeah. They had close ties with the longtime strongman in Sudan. He's out.
That's why I'm talking about soft power, and it's very important if you have a long-term strategy. Second thing, everybody talks about the Chinese and how they're being neo-colonialist and this and that. But again, 200 billion of trade, and that doesn't count the direct aid or direct investment. When an African state wants a bridge or a highway or a train, they take Chinese loans, they build their stuff, and they know the Chinese are not going to leave with their railway or their stadium or their factory. So basically, they're locked in a deal. If you want to have influence today in Africa, you need to bring that sort of leverage. Look at Egypt. Everybody says, they're close to Russia, but Egypt lives because of, Saudi and Gulf money. And basically, their strategic alliance is there. If the Russians want to have a real say in Egypt today, they have to bring cash, projects, involvement on the long term, which is not specifically political.
And that brings us to one final point on all of this. We've mentioned a lot of countries, right, over this past hour, George Kazolis. There's one we haven't talked about so much, the United States. And Russia, and we noticed it with Tuesday, the Russians in Sochi with that deal they brokered between the Turks and the Syrians, effectively filling a void that the Americans left just a couple of weeks ago there. But there's the sense right now that because the State Department's in a bit of a disarray under this administration, that Russia also sees an opportunity in Africa.
Well, they're actually doing it for the peace talks in the Central African Republic. It was the Russians who were involved in organizing them and getting the different leaders to Khartoum for those peace talks. I mean, the Russians have been playing that role all along. And I just wanted to mention, let's not forget AFRICOM and Flintlock and the American forces in the Sahel as well, helping the French. I mean, we mustn't forget what's going on there, And so I think the Russians, I agree completely, the Russians are playing a very good political game, a very good geopolitical game. Let's not forget they have a very small defense budget, about half of Saudi Arabia's. Yet look what they're doing in the world. They saved Syria from all these Islamists backed by the West. And now they're making inroads in Africa.
Well, that's how they're selling it.
Without hardly any means.
Yeah, but if you look at arms sales, 70% of them are in Algeria, one state. So, I mean, it's not that wide. It's not that
Yeah,
André Ngombe?
Yeah, one thing, don't get me wrong. I'm not preaching an anti-Russian speeches. I'm just saying that Russia is right to defend what they think it's the
strategic
Russian interest. But I saw on the African side that the country doesn't have a clear strategy of what's going on. They don't have a strategy on having a true sovereignty on their border, on the sea, and the water, ocean, and the resource. So going to Russia just like this is like going to China, is like going back to any other country. We need to have a clear understanding on what Africa needs. And then we can trade with people on a same basis. And Russia is really right to do what they do because they need their power, they need to have access, they need to have all of that. And we need to understand what Africa needs.
Anastasia Shapochkina, how's it playing among Russians, this summit, these 2 days?
This is for the Russians again. This is a portrayal for Putin, at least. This is the portrayal of Russia's increasing influence. Okay, you have sanctions against us in the West. You are prohibiting us to go to the high diplomatic tables. But look at us. We can gather leaders. Leaders are going to come from other places, and therefore positioning Russia again and again as one of the leader countries who can assemble. It's not Putin going to Africa on an invitation, but it's all of the African leaders coming. So again,
it's Putin looking strong politically, but
Definitely.
We know when we saw recent elections, in local elections in Russia, that domestically a lot of stuff is broken.
We have
so
to
how
remember
do you equate
that,
the two?
We have to remember that everything that has to do with Russia, we have to always distinguish what is the front window and what is behind. And that's in Africa as well as in Russia. In Africa, you have the front window. I've invited 50 leaders and hey, most of them showed up. Behind, 70% of arms trades, however, wound up in one country, and that's pretty much majority of the trade in any case. In Russia, the window, the dressing window is Putin organizing, in the footsteps of China, by the way, copy-paste after Beijing, organizing the same exact summit. And yes, I can do just as well as Beijing can. And then leaders come. However, behind, we all know, these were all Russian elections, not just municipal level, municipal, regional, some of the federal elections as well, but partial. All the Russian elections day, and Putin lost, even in Moscow, Putin lost, in Moscow especially, but even in the far away places, Putin lost, and United Russia Party lost, and a lot of people left United Russia Party. So of course you always have to distinguish and keep that in mind every time that you look at a sector, whether it is Rosneft showing that it's present all over the world, including Libya, for example, which is a failed state today, or it's Rosatom showing its new signed up contracts with Uganda. What is that worth? Versus the actual presence, and that still remains rather limited.
All right, we're going to leave it there for now. Anastasia Shapochkina, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Ziad Liman. George Kazolius, I want to thank André Ngombe. I want to thank as well William Gumeri for being with us from Johannesburg. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So just a quick look at some of the news websites in Africa and elsewhere covering this. You can see that Russia is getting a lot of coverage in various different media. This is africanews.com, focusing on the relations with the Ethiopian premier. If you look in the South African press, Bloomberg here talking about Russian nuclear bombers landing in South Africa in a rare cooperation this in a few days' time. So across a whole spectrum of news stories.
Yeah, they timed it seems, with that summit, those nuclear bombers paying a visit.
I suspect it's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Libération talking, this is a word that is coming back in some of the headlines of the press as well. Russe-Afrique.
Africa?
It's a neologism.
Doesn't roll off the tongue. Let's try it again.
So obviously coming from France-Afrique, which is a very very...
a cozy relationship between France and its former colonies.
Which suggests a certain degree of maybe corrupt dealings, I think it's fair to say, or at least very personal interests involved. So Russe-Afrique is being inaugurated by Putin in Sochi. That's the headline of this article in Libération, which is suggesting that this isn't just an international...
That's a great picture.
It is indeed.
So there's Putin at the wheel and there's Sisi next to him.
That's right, the co-chair of the inaugural summit to be held every 3 years. And they say in this piece in Libération that this is anything but soft power. It really is about interests. They go into a lot of details as well, mentioning some of the murkier dealings, for example, in the Central African Republic, where 3 independent Russian journalists were assassinated last year because they were investigating into a Russian oil mining company, Wagner. Evgeny Prigozhin, I probably completely mangled that pronunciation, but in any case, they were investigating into mining contracts that were awarded not just in Central African Republic, but in Madagascar and elsewhere.
And the mercenaries that defend them.
And well, they didn't live to tell the tale, unfortunately. So, using heavily connotated, words such as Russe Afrique, which have connotations, I think is perhaps appropriate. That's an article in the Africa Report talking about the murky business dealings in Central African Republic. Elsewhere, this is a piece in the Malian press, the editorial of Adam Thiam. He's also looking to the term Russe Afrique. But for him, it's more a case of African leaders going there with an open mind to see what Russia has to offer. Why wouldn't they? But he focuses in this article on the fact that there will be perhaps quite too much division between African leaders so that they won't present a strong enough common front for African interests in this summit. That was the point that Adam Thiam was making in that piece. If we move to Twitter, Le Russe Afrique, this is a response in French. Rush Africa only exists in anti-Putin fantasies. Russia helped the political freeing of a number of African colonized countries. So this is somebody who's seeing, I suppose, well, very much won over by the Russian perspective on this, that it's disinterested, civilized sort of partnership. This is another Twitter user, Shingai Andoro, saying a whole continent summoned to their lands. So I suppose...
That's right. Oh, I didn't mention it. The Japan-Africa summit just happened as well.
So
in August.
So I think that would betray a certain amount of fatigue with seeing African leaders each time leave for these summits taking place.
No one's forcing them to go, though.
True. This is one ironic tweet. Whether someone, I'm not sure if it's humorous or not, but it's got a lot of retweets in any case. All 54 African states have been sent a representative, and there are 43 heads of state. Africa has really changed. If it was the 70s or 80s, there would have been some military coups in the meantime.
Oh, that's right.
Well, with so many leaders outside of the country. Ha ha. Funny, maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, I'll finish with this in Kenya, in the Kenyan press. This is showing an Africa... Is it an Africa-Mars summit? Because there's been a summit between Africa and pretty much every other possibility in
the Martians are wondering, should we have our summit next?
Right, exactly.
When it's going to happen?
UFOs on the way down.
It will happen.
No, it will happen.
Okay.
It probably will.
James Green, many thanks. I want to thank our panel again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.